Sometimes the deepest wound in a child's heart is not caused by the parent who leaves, but by the parent who chooses not to stay. Harper Collins had spent 6 years convincing herself that hope was worth protecting, even when life gave her every reason to surrender it. On a cold November afternoon, she stood quietly at the edge of a cracked sidewalk, watching her little daughter climb the 3 worn wooden steps leading to a modest white house. The sky hung low with heavy grey clouds, and a chilly breeze carried scattered maple leaves across the empty street. Lily Collins, only 6 years old, held a tiny bouquet of white daisies against her pink coat with both hands, as though she were carrying the most valuable gift in the world. Every flower had come from the small garden behind the flower shop. Harper struggled to keep alive. Lily had picked each stem herself before sunrise, tying them together with a faded blue ribbon she insisted brought good luck. Harper wished she believed in luck as much as her daughter did. "Do you think Daddy will smile this time?" Lily had asked during the walk over. Harper had forced a gentle smile because mothers often carried impossible responsibilities. Sometimes protecting a child's heart meant telling a hopeful lie instead of an unbearable truth. "I think he will see how much love you put into those flowers," she had answered softly. Now she watched from the sidewalk as Lily knocked on the front door with tiny hopeful taps that seemed almost too quiet for the world to hear. One knock, then another, then a third. After several long seconds, footsteps approached from inside. The door opened halfway. The man standing there looked at Lily without surprise, as though he had expected someone else entirely. His expression remained distant, almost impatient. Lily's face immediately brightened. "Hi, Daddy," she said with a smile so innocent it made Harper's chest tighten. "I brought these for you." She carefully lifted the bouquet with both hands. He looked at the flowers only briefly before raising his eyes toward Harper standing near the sidewalk. His voice remained calm, but every word felt colder than the November wind. "I told you not to bring her here anymore." Harper took a slow breath before walking one step closer. "She only wanted to see you for a few minutes." He shook his head. "That is not my life anymore." Lily looked from her father, why adults suddenly sounded like strangers. "Daddy," she asked quietly, "did I do something wrong?" The question lingered in the air. He never answered it. Instead, he stepped backward into the house. "Please do not come back." Then the door closed. Not loudly, not violently, just firmly enough to make it clear that the conversation was over. Lily remained frozen on the porch. The bouquet slowly slipped from her little hands before falling onto the weathered wooden boards. Several white petals drifted into the cold breeze. Harper felt her own heart breaking, but she knew this was not her moment to cry. It belonged to her daughter. She hurried forward, climbed the porch steps, and gently knelt beside Lily. The little girl continued staring at the closed door. "Maybe he did not see the flowers," she whispered. Harper wrapped both arms around her daughter, holding her close against the cold. "He saw them, sweetheart." Lily lowered her eyes toward the scattered petals. "Maybe next time I should bring roses." Harper closed her eyes for only a second, trying to steady the tears threatening to escape. "You never have to earn someone's love." Lily finally looked up at her mother. "Then why does Daddy not want me?" There was no answer gentle enough for a child to understand. Harper simply kissed the top of Lily's head and held her tighter while the first light raindrops began falling around them. Across the quiet street, the low rumble of powerful engines slowly broke the silence. 3 identical black luxury sedans turned the corner one after another before stopping directly in front of the house. Every curtain on the block seemed to move as curious neighbors looked outside. The rear door of the first sedan opened. A tall man wearing a charcoal overcoat stepped onto the rain-darkened pavement with calm confidence. His dark hair moved slightly in the breeze, and his sharp blue eyes immediately settled on the little girl standing beside her mother. Matteo Bellini did not look toward the house behind them. He did not look at the neighbors watching from their windows. He looked only at the child holding a faded blue ribbon where a bouquet had been only moments before. Dominic Luciano and Raphael Marino quietly stepped from the other vehicles, remaining a respectful distance behind him. Harper instinctively placed one protective hand on Lily's shoulder. Every instinct told her to leave, yet her feet refused to move. Before anyone could speak, Lily bent down, rescued the only daisy that had not been crushed, brushed a little rainwater from its white petals, walked across the street with quiet determination, and held the flower toward the unfamiliar man. Looking directly into Matteo's eyes, she smiled with heartbreaking innocence and asked, "Mister, would you like a flower?" Matteo Bellini had negotiated with politicians, billion-dollar executives, and men who believed fear could solve every problem, yet none of them had ever looked at him the way a little girl holding a single white daisy did. Rain gathered on the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat as he slowly bent down until he was at Lily Collins's eye level. For a brief moment the quiet neighborhood seemed to disappear. The curious faces behind half-open curtains no longer mattered. Neither did the expensive cars waiting at the curb. Only the child standing in front of him existed. Lily held the tiny flower toward him with complete sincerity, as though rejection had not visited her heart only seconds earlier. Harper Collins watched from a few feet away, every protective instinct urging her to pull her daughter back. She knew nothing about the three men who had arrived in black luxury sedans except the whispers everyone in the city had heard. Powerful men rarely appeared without reason, and ordinary people like her usually paid the price when they crossed paths with extraordinary lives. Yet Matteo did something Harper never expected. He accepted the daisy with both hands, treating it as carefully as though it were made of crystal instead of delicate petals. "Thank you," he said quietly. His deep voice carried no trace of pity, only genuine gratitude. Lily smiled with visible relief. "I thought maybe nobody wanted flowers today." Matteo looked at the little blossom resting in his hand before meeting her eyes again. "Who told you that?" She glanced back toward the closed front door across the street, then shrugged with a bravery no 6-year-old should ever have needed to learn. "Sometimes people are too busy." Harper felt the words strike her harder than anything Lily's father had said. Children always found gentle ways to explain painful truths. Dominic Luciano and Rafael Marino exchanged a silent look behind Matteo. Both men had witnessed countless negotiations over the years, but neither had ever seen their friend kneel in the rain for a stranger. Matteo carefully tucked the daisy into the breast pocket of his coat, where it remained visible against the dark fabric. "Now I have something important to take care of," he said. Lily's face brightened. "Flowers like it when people take care of them." Matteo nodded. "I think people do too." Harper finally stepped forward, resting one hand lightly on Lily's shoulder. "Thank you for being kind," she said politely. "We should let you continue with your day." Matteo stood slowly, his attention shifting toward Harper for the first time. She noticed calm blue eyes that revealed almost nothing, yet somehow they lacked the coldness she had expected. "Your daughter is remarkable," he said. Harper smiled faintly despite herself. She has always believed the world deserves one more chance than most people would give it. Before Matteo could answer, Lily reached into the pocket of her little coat and pulled out another small flower she had forgotten was there. It was bent from being carried all morning, but she carefully straightened the stem before walking toward Dominic. "This one is for you," she said. Dominic looked genuinely surprised. "For me? Nobody should feel left out." Dominic accepted the flower with an awkward smile that made Raphael quietly laugh under his breath. "Looks like she noticed," Raphael teased gently. Lily searched her pocket again before frowning. "I only have two." Without hesitation removed the daisy from his own pocket and handed it to Raphael. "Then we can share." For the first time in years, all three men smiled at the same moment. Harper noticed the change immediately. The tension surrounding them seemed to soften beneath the impossible innocence of one little girl who believed flowers could solve loneliness. Rain continued falling gently around them until one of Matteo's drivers hurried over, carrying a large black umbrella. Matteo accepted it only to open it above Lily and Harper instead of himself. Cold raindrops soaked his own shoulders while Lily remained perfectly dry. She looked up at him with worried eyes. "You are getting wet." Matteo smiled faintly. "I will be all right." She shook her head. "My mummy says people get sick when they forget to take care of themselves." Harper almost apologized for her daughter's honesty, but Matteo simply nodded. "Your mother sounds very wise." The words caught Harper off guard. Few people had ever described her that way. She spent most days wondering whether she was doing enough just to keep the lights on inside her tiny flower shop. Before anyone spoke again, a black sedan quietly pulled up behind the three waiting vehicles. A man in a tailored suit stepped out carrying a slim leather folder. He walked directly to Matteo and lowered his voice, but Harper noticed the respectful urgency in his posture. Matteo accepted the folder without opening it immediately. Instead, he looked once more at Lily, who had begun collecting the fallen flower petals from the wet sidewalk, because in her words, beautiful things should never be left behind. Only then did Matteo glance at the first page inside the folder. His expression remained controlled, yet something changed in his eyes. Dominic noticed it instantly. Raphael stopped smiling. Harper could not see the documents, But she saw Matteo quietly close the folder and look toward her with a seriousness that had not been there before. Whatever he had just learned had nothing to do with business. It had everything to do with HarperCollins and the little girl still gathering broken flower petals one by one. HarperCollins had learned that the most dangerous moments in life rarely announce themselves. They often arrive disguised as ordinary afternoons, hidden behind polite smiles and quiet conversations. She stood in the light November rain, holding Lily's small hand, while Matteo Bellini remained motionless with the leather folder tucked beneath one arm. The little daisy still rested inside the pocket of his charcoal coat, a fragile reminder that even the strongest men sometimes carried unexpected treasures. Lily finished gathering the last scattered flower petal from the sidewalk before slipping it carefully into her tiny coat pocket. Flowers should stay together, she whispered to herself. Harper felt her heart tighten. Even after being rejected, her daughter was still trying to save something beautiful. Matteo watched the child for a long moment before quietly opening the folder. The pages inside contained far more than names and numbers. Years of financial records, legal filings, property documents, and communication logs painted a picture no father should ever have created. Dominic Luciano stepped beside him, reading silently over his shoulder while Rafael Marino remained near the vehicles, scanning the quiet neighborhood with practiced awareness. Harper could not see the documents, but she noticed Dominic's expression slowly harden before he looked toward the closed front door across the street. "It is confirmed," Dominic said quietly. "Everything matches." Matteo closed the folder without another glance. Yet every word carried unmistakable certainty. Harper deserves the truth. Harper instinctively tightened her grip on Lily's hand. "What truth?" Matteo hesitated only briefly. "Your daughter's father recently contacted people he believed could solve his financial problems." Harper frowned. "He has been in debt for years." Matteo nodded. This was different. She searched his face, already fearing the answer. Different how? Matteo did not look away. He offered to surrender his parental rights in exchange for money. The world around Harper seemed to grow strangely quiet. Even the rain felt distant. "No," she whispered almost automatically. "He would never—" The sentence refused to finish itself. Deep inside, another voice reminded her how easily he had closed the door only minutes earlier. Matteo continued carefully, choosing each word with obvious restraint. He was not trying to reconnect with Lily. He was negotiating with people he believed would pay for legal access to her future. Harper stared at him in disbelief. Her first instinct was to deny everything. Her second was to remember every birthday he had missed, every promise he had broken, every excuse she had repeated to protect Lily from disappointment. Suddenly those excuses felt unbearably fragile. Lily looked up at her mother with innocent curiosity. "Mommy, what does negotiate mean?" Harper forced a gentle smile despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "It is a grown-up conversation, sweetheart." Lily accepted the answer without question before noticing a small snail slowly crossing the wet sidewalk. She carefully moved it onto the grass so nobody would accidentally step on it. Matteo watched the simple act of kindness in complete silence. "She protects everything smaller than herself," he murmured. Harper nodded faintly. "She always has." Matteo slipped the folder back beneath his arm. She should never have needed someone to protect her from her own father. Those words struck Harper harder than any accusation. For years she had blamed herself for choosing the wrong man, for failing to give Lily the family every child deserved. Yet standing there beside Matteo, she realized none of those failures belonged to Lily. Across the street, the curtains inside the White House shifted slightly. Someone was watching again. Raphael noticed immediately and quietly stepped closer to Matteo. "We should leave," he said. Matteo agreed with a slight nod before turning toward Harper. "May I ask you something?" She looked at him cautiously. "Of course. Where do you work?" The question surprised her. "I own a small flower shop about 10 minutes from here," Matteo asked another. "Do you and Lily spend most of your day there?" "Almost every day." Dominic exchanged another silent glance with Matteo. Harper immediately recognized the concern passing between them. "Why does that matter?" Matteo answered honestly. "Because if someone has been collecting information about Lily, predictable routines become valuable." Harper felt another wave of uneasiness. She had never imagined her ordinary life could attract anyone's attention. Bills, flowers, school pickups, grocery lists, and bedtime stories had always seemed too simple for the world to notice. Matteo looked toward Lily, who had now discovered a tiny yellow leaf shaped like a heart and proudly tucked it beside the rescued flower petals. "Children should never have to think about being careful," he said quietly. "That responsibility belongs to adults." Harper searched his face, trying to understand why a man she had met less than an hour earlier sounded more determined to protect her daughter than the man who had helped bring Lily into the world. Before she could ask another question, Matteo's phone vibrated softly. He answered, listened for only a few seconds, then ended the call. His expression remained composed, but something had changed. He looked back at Harper with quiet urgency. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "I believe it would be wise if I visited your flower shop today. There are a few things I think you should know before someone else reaches you first." Harper Collins had always believed that flowers taught the same lesson over and over again. The strongest blooms were never the ones protected from every storm. They were the ones that survived because someone cared enough to keep nurturing them after the rain. The drive back to Collins Floral felt unusually quiet. Lily sat in the back seat beside her mother, carefully holding the faded blue ribbon and the tiny heart-shaped leaf she had rescued from the sidewalk, as though they were priceless treasures. Every few minutes she glanced through the window at the 3 black luxury sedans following at a respectful distance. "Mommy," she asked softly, "are Mr. Matteo and his friends coming to buy flowers?" Harper looked into the rearview mirror and forced a gentle smile despite the questions racing through her own mind. "Maybe they are." Lily nodded with complete satisfaction. "I hope they like daisies." Matteo Bellini listened from the vehicle behind them, watching Harper's aging sedan move steadily through the afternoon traffic. He had built an empire by trusting facts instead of assumptions, but everything about Harper Collins refused to fit the pattern he had expected. The investigation had uncovered years of unpaid sacrifices, honest work, and relentless devotion to one little girl. There were no hidden accounts, no suspicious contacts, no shortcuts. Harper's entire life revolved around keeping Lily safe, even when she barely had enough to keep herself afloat. Dominic Luciano quietly closed the leather folder resting on his lap. "Everything about her checks out." Rafael Marino looked out the passenger window. "Which makes Lily's father even harder to understand." Matteo's answer came without hesitation. "Some people lose their way because life defeats them. Others lose their way because they stop choosing what is right." Collins Floral stood on the corner of a quiet neighborhood street where old brick buildings still carried hand-painted signs instead of bright digital displays. Harper unlocked the front door, and the familiar scent of fresh roses, eucalyptus, lilies, and damp soil immediately wrapped around her like an old friend. The little shop was modest, but every shelf reflected years of care. Glass jars lined the wooden counter, handwritten price tags hung from wicker baskets, and fresh bouquets waited patiently for customers who appreciated beauty more than extravagance. Lily ran toward the work table in the back, humming soft as she filled a tiny vase with water before placing the rescued daisy inside. "It deserves another chance," she whispered. Matteo noticed the simple gesture the moment he entered. He had seen expensive works of art displayed in private collections worth millions of dollars, yet somehow one little girl saving a damaged flower felt far more valuable. Harper turned toward him. "You said there were things I should know." Matteo nodded. "There are." Before he continued, the bell above the front door chimed. An elderly customer stepped inside carrying a reusable shopping bag. Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly when she saw Harper. Harper immediately shook her head. "Not at all." Lily hurried over, carrying a tiny bouquet she had arranged from leftover flowers. "These are for you," she said happily. Mrs. Henderson blinked in surprise. "Sweetheart, I did not order any flowers." Lily smiled. "You looked lonely yesterday." The older woman accepted the bouquet with trembling hands, her eyes shining with grateful tears. "Nobody has given me flowers in years." Matteo watched quietly as Harper knelt beside Lily. "That was very thoughtful," she whispered. Lily shrugged as though kindness required no explanation. "Flowers are happier when people smile." Mrs. Henderson thanked Harper before leaving the shop with the little bouquet held carefully against her chest. The door closed behind her, and silence settled once again. Matteo looked around the room before speaking. "Your daughter has a remarkable gift." Harper smiled faintly. "She notices pain before most adults notice people." Matteo slowly reached into his coat pocket and removed the white daisy Lily had given him. Despite the rain, he had protected it all the way across the city. He walked to the small vase holding Lily's rescued flower and gently placed his daisy beside it. "Some flowers should not be alone," he said quietly. Lily's face brightened. "Now they are a family." Harper felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest. It had been a long time since anyone had added something to her life instead of taking something away. Matteo finally turned toward her with calm seriousness. Mrs. Collins, the people who contacted Lily's father were not interested in him. They were interested in finding a legal path to your daughter. We have already interrupted that plan. But I believe caution is still necessary until every question has been answered. Harper instinctively looked toward Lily, who was happily arranging flowers as though the world remained exactly as it should be. "What should I do?" she asked quietly. Matteo answered without hesitation. "Keep living your life. Let Lily keep being a child. Allow us to worry about everything else." Before Harper could respond, the reflection of a familiar blue sedan slowly appeared in the flower shop window. It rolled past the storefront at an unusually slow pace before continuing down the block without stopping. Matteo noticed it immediately. So did Dominic and Raphael. Harper followed their eyes toward the street. And for the first time that day she realized the quiet little flower shop was no longer invisible to the rest of the world. Harper Collins had spent years believing that ordinary people disappeared into the background of the city. She never imagined a tiny flower shop could become the center of someone else's attention. The reflection of the blue sedan slowly faded from the front window, leaving behind an uneasy silence that settled over Collins' floral. Outside, customers continued walking past the storefront without noticing anything unusual, but inside the shop, Matteo Bellini, Dominic Luciano and Raphael Marino had already memorized the license plate, the driver's posture, and the precise time the vehicle had passed. Harper noticed the subtle exchange of glances between the three men. None of them looked frightened. That somehow worried her even more. People who stayed calm often understood dangers long before everyone else. Lily remained completely unaware. She stood on a small wooden stool behind the work table, carefully trimming flower stems with child-safe scissors while humming softly to herself. Every few seconds she paused to smile at the two daisies resting together inside the small glass vase. "They look happier now," she whispered. Harper watched her daughter for a moment before turning back toward Matteo. "That blue car has something to do with everything you told me, does it not?" Matteo answered honestly. "I believe it does. Who are they?" "We are still confirming that." Harper folded her arms to steady the nervousness growing inside her chest. "You keep saying you believe and you think. I need certainty." Matteo met her eyes with quiet respect. "I never promise certainty until I have earned it, but I can promise that you and Lily will not face this alone." Those words lingered in the room longer than Harper expected. For years she had handled every unexpected bill, every sleepless night, every broken appliance, and every disappointed birthday without asking anyone for help. The idea of someone willingly sharing her burden felt unfamiliar enough to be almost uncomfortable. Before she could answer, Lily skipped over carrying another tiny bouquet made from leftover flowers. She walked directly toward Raphael Marino and held it out with a bright smile. "This one is for you." Raphael accepted it with obvious surprise. "For me?" Lily nodded. "You smiled at my mommy when she looked scared. That helped." Harper felt emotion catch unexpectedly in her throat. She had not even realized Raphael had done it, but Lily had noticed. Children often saw kindness adults overlooked. Dominic quietly laughed. "You missed your chance, Raphael. Now you have responsibilities." Flowers always give people responsibilities. Matteo raised one eyebrow with genuine curiosity. "What kind of responsibilities?" Lily answered without hesitation. "You have to remember that somebody believed you deserved something beautiful." Silence filled the little flower shop. Harper looked at her daughter with quiet amazement. She had spent years teaching Lily how to care for flowers, never realizing the child had been learning something far deeper. Matteo slowly looked down at the white daisy still tucked inside his coat pocket. It was beginning to fade around the edges after spending the afternoon with him, yet he made no effort to replace it. "She is right," he said softly. A delivery truck pulled up outside the shop, interrupting the peaceful moment. The weekly shipment of fresh flowers had arrived. Harper instinctively reached for the front door, but before she could step outside, Matteo gently stopped her with a quiet gesture. "Allow us." Harper frowned. "You do not need to unload flowers." Dominic smiled. "Neither do you by yourself." Within minutes, the three men who had built reputations for commanding boardrooms and negotiating impossible agreements were carrying buckets of roses, peonies, lilies and hydrangeas into a tiny neighborhood flower shop. The delivery driver looked so confused that he checked the address twice before leaving. Lily laughed every time another bucket came through the doorway. "You are getting better at flower deliveries," she proudly informed Matteo. "I have an excellent teacher," he replied. Harper could not help smiling. The little shop felt different somehow, lighter, warmer. As the final shipment was organized inside the cooler, Matteo quietly walked toward the front display window. Across the street, the blue sedan appeared once more, slowing briefly before continuing toward the next intersection. This time, Matteo noticed something different. The driver was not looking at him. The driver was watching Lily through the front window. His expression remained perfectly controlled, but Dominic immediately recognized the change. "What did you see?" Matteo kept his eyes on the disappearing vehicle, not interest. His voice became quieter than before. Recognition. Harper felt every instinct inside her awaken at once. She followed Matteo's gaze toward the street before looking back at Lily, who was happily arranging tiny white daisies into another bouquet. Completely unaware that someone outside had just recognized the little girl she loved more than her own life, Harper Collins realized that fear became far more unsettling once it had a face. The blue sedan no longer felt like an ordinary car passing through the neighborhood. It had become a silent reminder that someone outside the warm walls of her flower shop already knew who Lily was. She instinctively looked toward her daughter, who remained completely absorbed in arranging tiny white daisies into a miniature bouquet that would probably be given away before the day ended. Lily had no idea that three powerful men had shifted from casual concern to quiet vigilance because of one lingering glance through a car window. Matteo Bellini remained standing near the storefront, watching the empty street long after the sedan had disappeared around the corner. Years of experience had taught him to trust patterns more than coincidence, and nothing about the afternoon felt accidental anymore. Dominic Luciano quietly stepped beside him. "Our people will have the vehicle within the hour," he said in a calm voice that never carried unnecessary urgency. Matteo nodded slightly. "Find out who is behind the wheel. I am more interested in the reason than the name." Rafael Marino returned from checking the alley behind the shop and gave a reassuring nod toward Harper. "Everything outside is quiet." Harper appreciated the effort, but the word quiet no longer brought comfort. Sometimes silence simply meant the next answer had not arrived yet. She walked toward the cooler to organize fresh roses, trying to keep her hands busy while her thoughts refused to slow down. Every stem she trimmed reminded her how fragile beautiful things could be. Lily suddenly appeared beside her, holding a tiny watering can no larger than her hand. "Mommy, the little daisies are thirsty." Harper smiled despite the heaviness pressing against her heart. "Then we should not keep them waiting." Lily carefully watered every small arrangement one by one, speaking softly to each flower as though introducing herself to new friends. Matteo watched from across the room without interrupting. "Does she always talk to them?" he asked quietly. Harper laughed under her breath for the first time that day. Ever since she learned flowers grow better when people care for them, she decided they'd probably enjoy kind words too. Matteo looked at Lily with thoughtful eyes. Perhaps she is right. A few minutes later, the bell above the front door rang again. A young mother entered carrying a toddler bundled inside a stroller. She hesitated when she noticed the three sharply dressed men inside the tiny flower shop, but Lily immediately walked over holding a single daisy. "This one is free," she said happily. "Babies should always have flowers." The young mother accepted it with a grateful smile before selecting a bouquet for herself. As she paid Harper, she quietly whispered, "Your daughter makes this place feel different." Harper looked toward Lily and answered honestly, "She always has." After the customer left, Matteo walked slowly through the shop, stopping in front of a faded photograph hanging near the register. It showed Harper several years earlier on the day Collins Floral first opened. The paint on the sign looked fresh, and Lily, barely 3 years old, sat on an overturned flower bucket laughing while holding a sunflower almost bigger than her face. "You built all of this yourself," Matteo observed. Harper nodded, with more determination than money. "You never considered leaving?" She smiled gently while adjusting a vase of lilies. "Flowers taught me something years ago. If you keep transplanting them every time the weather changes, they never grow deep enough roots to bloom." Matteo understood there was more than gardening hidden inside those words. Before he could answer, Dominic's phone vibrated. He stepped toward the back of the shop, listened quietly for less than a minute, then returned with an expression that remained controlled but noticeably more focused. "The driver has been identified," he said. Harper immediately stopped what she was doing. Matteo looked at Dominic without speaking. "The vehicle has no connection to Lily's father," Dominic continued. "It belongs to a private investigator." Harper frowned in confusion. "A private investigator? Why would someone hire one to follow my daughter?" Dominic exchanged a brief glance with Matteo before answering. We do not know who hired him yet. Matteo's voice remained steady, but now we know this was planned. Harper looked toward Lily, who was gently tying another faded blue ribbon around a tiny bouquet while humming the same cheerful tune she always sang when she was happy. The contrast between her daughter's peaceful little world and the conversation unfolding only a few feet away made Harper's chest ache. She refused to allow fear to steal that innocence. Matteo seemed to recognize the silent promise forming inside her. Mrs. Collins, he said quietly, until we know the entire truth, I would like someone near you and Lily at all times. Harper instinctively wanted to refuse. She had spent years proving she could survive without depending on anyone. But before the words reached her lips, Lily skipped over holding the newest bouquet she had finished. She stretched it toward Matteo with her brightest smile yet. This one is special, she said, because families should always have flowers waiting when they come home. Harper looked at her daughter, then at the man carefully accepting the bouquet with both hands, and for the first time since this unexpected journey had begun, she quietly wondered whether life had already started building a family neither of them had been searching for. Harper Collins had always believed that trust grew much more slowly than flowers. A seed only needed sunlight, water, and time. Trust demanded courage, patience, and the willingness to believe that tomorrow could be kinder than yesterday. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor of Collins' Floral, she watched Lily place the tiny bouquet into Matteo Bellini's hands as naturally as though he had always belonged inside their little shop. The sight should have felt impossible. Instead, it felt strangely familiar. Matteo accepted the bouquet with quiet gratitude, carefully adjusting the blue ribbon so it would not become wrinkled. Thank you, he said. Lily smiled proudly. Now you have flowers waiting when you go home. Matteo looked at the bouquet for a long moment before asking, and what if I do not have many flowers at home? Lily answered with the simple certainty only children possessed. Then you start with one. Harper lowered her eyes for a brief second, pretending to organize a display of carnations so neither of them would notice the emotion quietly rising inside her. She had spent years trying to give Lily every reason to believe the world still contained goodness, never imagining that one day her daughter would become the person teaching that lesson to someone else. Dominic Luciano quietly stepped outside after receiving another phone call, leaving Rafael Marino to help unload the last empty flower buckets near the cooler. The peaceful rhythm inside the shop slowly returned. Customers wandered in and out, filling the little store with warm conversation and the gentle fragrance of fresh blooms. Matteo remained near the counter, answering every curious question Lily asked him with surprising patience. Do you have a favorite flower? She wondered. He thought for a moment before looking at the white daisy still resting inside his coat pocket. I think I do now. Lily laughed happily. Daisies are brave. They keep growing even when people forget about them. Matteo nodded. That sounds like someone else I know. Harper looked toward them just as Lily wrapped both hands around the small watering can she carried everywhere. Do you want to help me water the flowers? She asked. Matteo glanced at Harper first, silently asking permission. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before smiling. She takes that responsibility very seriously. Together they moved slowly from one arrangement to another, Lily carefully explaining which flowers needed only a little water and which ones preferred more. Matteo followed every instruction exactly as she gave it. Customers quietly smiled as they watched one of the city's most respected businessmen patiently learning how to care for daisies from a 6-year-old girl. One elderly customer even whispered to Harper. He listens to her the way most people listen to their grandparents. Harper smiled politely, but inside she realized the woman was right. Matteo never spoke down to Lily. He never dismissed her thoughts because of her age. He treated every question as though it deserved an honest answer. That simple respect meant more to Harper than expensive gifts ever could. Late in the afternoon, Dominic returned carrying a slim envelope. He waited until Lily wandered toward the back work table before quietly approaching Matteo. We confirmed the investigator's client, he said. Harper immediately looked up. Matteo accepted the envelope without opening it. Who hired him? Dominic answered in a low voice. Harper frowned in confusion. Why would a law office hire someone to follow my daughter? Matteo slowly opened the file and read the first page. His expression remained calm, but Harper noticed the thoughtful silence that always followed difficult information. After a moment he handed the documents to her. Read the highlighted section. Harper's hands trembled slightly as she looked down. The investigator had not been hired to harm Lily. He had been gathering evidence for a legal case involving her father. Several attorneys had refused to represent him after discovering inconsistencies in his claims, and the investigation had eventually uncovered his attempt to exchange parental rights for financial gain. Instead of supporting him, the law firm had immediately reported the information to the proper authorities and terminated all contact. Harper slowly lowered the papers, feeling an enormous weight lift from her shoulders. "So nobody is trying to take Lily?" Matteo gently shook his head. "No," Dominic smiled for the first time that day. The investigation continued only because the attorneys wanted proof before notifying the authorities. Harper closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by relief. The fear that had quietly followed her for days finally began to loosen its grip. Just then, Lily skipped back toward them, carrying 3 tiny daisy crowns she had woven from leftover stems. Without saying a word, she placed one on Dominic's head, another on Raphael's, and the last one on Matteo's. She stepped back with complete satisfaction before clapping her hands. Now everybody laughed openly. Dominic tried to remove the crown but stopped when Lily frowned. Matteo left his exactly where she had placed it. Harper looked at the 3 powerful men standing inside her tiny flower shop wearing handmade daisy crowns, and for the first time in many years, laughter filled the room more completely than worry. As the afternoon sunlight faded beyond the windows, she quietly realized that sometimes the safest place in the world was not built with walls or locked doors. Sometimes it was built by people who chose, day after day, to stand beside one another. Harper Collins discovered that peace did not arrive all at once. It returned in tiny moments, almost shyly, asking permission to stay. The laughter that filled Collins' floral that afternoon lingered long after the customers had gone home. Even after Dominic Luciano reluctantly removed the daisy crown Lily had placed on his head, and Raphael Marino jokingly claimed he looked better as a florist than a businessman, the little flower shop somehow felt warmer than it ever had before. Harper quietly locked the front door as the last rays of sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor, painting golden reflections through rows of fresh roses and white lilies. Lily remained at the work table, carefully wrapping small bouquets that Harper planned to donate to the nursing home the following morning. She always insisted every bouquet needed a handwritten note. "Flowers should never arrive alone," she often said. Matteo Bellini stood nearby, watching her write each card with slow, careful letters. One card read, "I hope today is kinder than yesterday." Another simply said, "Someone is thinking about you." Matteo had spent years receiving expensive gifts that meant very little. Yet, those uneven handwritten notes carried more sincerity than anything he could remember. Harper noticed the quiet expression on his face. "She writes every message herself," she explained. "Sometimes she spends more time on the note than the flowers." Matteo smiled faintly. "She understands something most adults forget." Harper looked up from trimming eucalyptus stems. "What is that?" He gently picked up one of Lily's cards before answering. "People rarely remember what they receive. They remember how someone made them feel." Harper lowered her eyes. Those words stayed with her because they described Lily perfectly. Her daughter had never measured kindness by its size. She measured it by its heart. As they finished preparing the bouquets, Raphael quietly carried several boxes toward the delivery van while Dominic completed a few repairs around the shop that Harper had been postponing for months. A loose cabinet hinge, a flickering light above the cooler, and a stubborn front door lock all somehow worked perfectly within 30 minutes. Harper shook her head in disbelief. "You really did not have to do all of this." Dominic smiled as he packed away his tools. "Lily informed me that families fix things before they become bigger problems." Harper laughed softly. "She says that?" "Several times." Matteo glanced toward Lily, who was now standing on a small stool watering every plant inside the shop one final time before closing. "She has a remarkable way of changing people without realizing she is doing it." Harper looked at her daughter with quiet pride. "She changed me long before she changed anyone else." The evening grew darker, and after closing the shop they walked together toward Harper's apartment only 3 blocks away. Matteo insisted on carrying the donated bouquets while Lily proudly carried the smallest arrangement herself. The neighborhood streets glowed beneath old-fashioned streetlights, and autumn leaves drifted gently across the sidewalks. For the first time in many days, Harper realized she was no longer looking over her shoulder every few seconds. The weight she had been carrying since that heartbreaking morning had finally begun to lift. As they passed a small neighborhood park, Lily suddenly stopped beside an empty flower bed surrounded by weathered bricks. She whispered, "Why is nothing growing here?" Harper looked at the neglected patch of soil. I suppose nobody has planted anything in a long time. Lily turned toward Matteo with hopeful eyes. Could we fix it? Matteo looked at the forgotten flower bed before quietly nodding. I think we can. The next morning, before the flower shop even opened, 3 pickup trucks arrived carrying fresh soil, gardening tools, dozens of flowering plants donated anonymously through one of Matteo's charitable foundations. Neighbors stepped outside in surprise as Matteo, Dominic, Raphael, Harper and Lily spent the morning planting daisies, lavender, hydrangeas, and colorful wildflowers together. Children walking to school stopped to help. Elderly residents brought lemonade and homemade cookies. Someone offered extra gardening gloves. Another neighbor donated a wooden bench. By lunchtime, what had been an abandoned patch of dirt had become the beginning of a community garden. Harper stood quietly beneath the warm sunlight, watching strangers laugh together over something as simple as planting flowers. She realized none of them knew why Matteo had truly come into her life. They only saw a man helping build something beautiful beside a little girl who believed every empty place deserved another chance. As Lily gently pressed the last daisy into the soil, she looked up at Matteo with dirt covering both of her tiny gloves. Now people will smile when they walk by. Matteo looked around at the neighbors already admiring the new garden before resting one hand gently on Lily's shoulder. You did not just plant flowers today, he said softly. You reminded an entire neighborhood that hope grows when someone is willing to plant the first seed. Harper watched the two of them standing together beneath the morning sun, and although she could not explain why, the picture before her no longer looked like 3 strangers whose paths had crossed by accident. It looked like the quiet beginning of the family Lily had been growing all along, one flower at a time. Harper Collins had never imagined that a forgotten flower bed could change an entire neighborhood, yet only a few days after the community garden was planted, something remarkable began to happen. Every morning before Collins' Floral opened, someone quietly watered the flowers. By the afternoon, another neighbor had pulled weeds or planted fresh herbs beside the daisies. Children walked to school a few minutes earlier just to check which blossoms had opened overnight, while elderly couples sat together on the new wooden bench sharing coffee beneath the lavender. The little garden no longer belonged to any one person. It belonged to everyone who had decided that beautiful things were worth protecting. Harper often stood outside the flower shop before sunrise, watching the first rays of light touch the white petals Lily had planted with such careful hands. For the first time in years, she felt as though the neighborhood was no longer simply the place where she survived. It had become the place where she belonged. Collins' Floral reflected that same quiet transformation. Customers arrived not only to buy bouquets but to hear Lily explain why every arrangement should contain at least one flower that made people smile. Some chose daisies because they reminded them of hope. Others picked lavender because it reminded them to slow down. Harper noticed that people often left the shop carrying more peace than flowers. Matteo Bellini continued visiting almost every morning, never making an announcement when he arrived. Sometimes he carried coffee for Harper. Other mornings he quietly replaced worn gardening tools before anyone noticed they needed replacing. Dominic Luciano somehow discovered every loose shelf, dripping faucet, and stubborn hinge inside the shop before Harper mentioned them, while Raphael Marino had become the unofficial delivery driver whenever large community orders arrived. None of them acted as though they were doing anything extraordinary. To them, helping had quietly become routine. Lily accepted their presence just as naturally as she accepted sunshine after rain. One Saturday morning, while arranging fresh white roses near the front display, Harper noticed Lily sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Matteo, with a large sheet of construction paper spread between them. Colored markers covered the wooden floor. "What are you two making?" Harper asked with a smile. Lily looked up excitedly. "A family tree." Harper's hands paused in mid-air. Matteo glanced toward her with the slightest uncertainty, allowing her every opportunity to redirect the conversation if she wished. Instead, Harper quietly walked closer. Lily proudly pointed at the paper. There was a large tree with bright green branches, and beneath it she had drawn herself holding a daisy almost as tall as she was. Beside Lily stood Harper, wearing a yellow dress with flowers in her hair. A third figure stood on the other side, wearing a charcoal coat and holding a watering can. "Who is that?" Harper asked gently, though she already knew the answer. Lily smiled. "That is Mr. Matteo, because he always helps things grow." Harper looked toward Matteo. He said nothing. He simply allowed Lily to tell her story. The little girl continued drawing more smiling figures around the tree. Dominic held a toolbox. Raphael carried flower boxes. Mrs. Henderson sat on the park bench, surrounded by blooming roses. Even Mrs. Bellini appeared in the picture, holding a basket of bread beside rows of daisies. "Everybody is here," Lily said happily. Harper noticed one branch remained empty. "What goes there?" Lily carefully drew a small bird resting among the leaves. "That is for people who are still finding their way home." The innocence of her answer settled quietly inside the room. Harper realized her daughter no longer measured family by names written on birth certificates. She measured family by consistency, kindness, and the people who kept showing up. Later that afternoon, while Lily helped Raphael deliver donated bouquets to the nursing home, and Dominic repaired the small wooden fence surrounding the community garden, Harper found herself alone with Matteo for the first time since they had met. They stood outside the flower shop watching a gentle breeze move through the newly planted flowers across the street. "She trusts you," Harper said softly. Matteo kept his eyes on the garden. "I hope I earn that trust every day. Most people try to impress children with promises." Matteo smiled faintly. "Children believe actions much sooner than promises." Harper nodded. "That is exactly how Lily thinks." Before either of them spoke again, a familiar sedan slowly stopped across the street. Harper instinctively tensed before recognizing the man stepping out. It was Lily's father. He stood beside the community garden for several quiet moments, looking at the flowers his daughter had planted. He made no attempt to approach the shop. Instead, he gently placed a fresh bouquet of white daisies beside the wooden sign marking the garden, then stepped back with lowered eyes. Harper watched silently from the doorway while Matteo remained beside her without speaking. The man lingered only long enough to read the handwritten plaque Lily had insisted on placing beneath the flowers. It read, "Every garden grows because someone chooses to care." After reading those words, he quietly turned and walked away without looking back. Harper realized that, for the first time, he had come not to ask for something, but simply to leave something behind. And somewhere deep inside her heart, she understood that healing sometimes began with the courage to let go instead of the hope of getting everything back. Harper Collins had once believed that life changed through dramatic moments. But she was beginning to understand that the strongest transformations often arrived quietly, one ordinary day at a time. Autumn slowly surrendered to early winter, and Collins Floral had become more than a neighborhood flower shop. It had become the place where birthdays were remembered, anniversaries were celebrated, lonely mornings felt a little brighter, and strangers somehow left feeling less like strangers. Every bouquet carried a handwritten note, because Lily insisted that flowers should always have something kind to say. Customers started asking whether the little girl had written their message herself, and Harper always smiled before answering yes. One crisp Saturday morning, sunlight poured through the front windows as Lily carefully arranged white daisies into a small glass vase. Matteo Bellini stood beside her, learning once again that every task seemed to take twice as long whenever a 6-year-old insisted on explaining why every flower deserved equal attention. "You cannot put all the pretty ones in the front," Lily said with complete seriousness. "The flowers in the back want to be seen too." Matteo quietly moved 2 daisies from the front to the middle of the arrangement. "Is that better?" Lily studied the bouquet with great concentration before smiling. "Now everybody gets a chance." Harper watched the exchange while trimming fresh eucalyptus stems behind the counter. She no longer questioned why Matteo visited every day. Somehow his presence had become as natural as the morning sunlight filling the little shop. Dominic Luciano stopped by carrying fresh pastries from the bakery down the street, while Raphael Marino appeared a few minutes later with replacement flower pots because he had noticed several older ones beginning to crack. None of them arrived with bodyguards or grand entrances anymore. They simply walked through the front door like neighbors. Around noon, Mrs. Henderson entered carrying a folded newspaper beneath one arm. Her face glowed with excitement. "Harper, you have to see this." She spread the newspaper across the counter and pointed to a full-page article featuring photographs of the community garden. The headline described how a forgotten empty lot had become the heart of an entire neighborhood after local volunteers transformed it into a place where everyone was welcome. Several photographs showed children planting flowers beside elderly residents, families sitting together on the wooden benches, and neighbors sharing gardening tools instead of simply walking past one another. In one corner of the page, A smaller photograph captured Lily kneeling beside a row of freshly planted daisies, while Matteo quietly held a watering can beside her. Harper stared at the image longer than she expected. Neither of them appeared aware that anyone had taken the photograph. They were simply smiling at the tiny flowers beginning to bloom. They called it the Garden of Second Chances, Mrs. Henderson said warmly. Lily looked up from her bouquet. That is a good name. Harper smiled. Why do you think so? Lily carefully adjusted one last daisy before answering. Because flowers never get angry when people plant them late. They just grow anyway. Matteo looked toward Harper, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke. Both understood that Lily was talking about much more than flowers. That afternoon the community gathered at the garden to celebrate its official opening. Children painted colorful signs, local musicians played acoustic songs beneath the maple trees, and volunteers handed out tiny seed packets to anyone willing to plant something at home. Harper wandered through the cheerful crowd carrying fresh bouquets donated by Collins Floral, while Lily proudly explained each flower's meaning to curious visitors. Dominic helped elderly neighbors assemble new wooden planters. Raphael spent nearly an hour teaching children how to water seedlings without damaging their roots. Matteo quietly repaired a loose section of fencing before anyone even noticed it needed attention. Watching them, Harper realized something she had been too afraid to admit. The three men who had entered her life like distant strangers had become the people everyone instinctively turned toward whenever something needed to be done. As the celebration slowly came to an end, Lily climbed onto the small wooden bench beneath the garden sign and called out, "Everybody wait." The conversations gradually faded as neighbors turned toward the little girl. She held a tiny bouquet of white daisies against her coat and looked around with complete confidence. "When Mommy and I first came here," she said, "this place was empty. Now it is full because everybody helped." She walked toward Matteo and gently placed the bouquet into his hands. "Thank you for helping flowers find a home." Matteo accepted the bouquet quietly, but before he could respond, Lily reached for Harper's hand and then took Matteo's with her other hand. She looked up at both of them with the same innocent smile that had survived rejection on a cold November afternoon. "Families grow the same way gardens do," she said softly, "one kind thing at a time." Harper felt tears gather in her eyes as neighbors around them smiled without saying a word. Standing beneath the winter sunlight surrounded by blooming flowers and people who had chosen kindness over indifference, she realized the little girl she had spent years trying to protect had quietly become the one teaching everyone else how to bloom. Harper Collins had spent so many years preparing herself for disappointment that happiness still felt unfamiliar when it arrived without asking permission. In the weeks that followed the opening of the Garden of Second Chances, life settled into a rhythm she had once believed existed only in other people's stories. Every morning began with the soft sound of Lily unlocking the flower shop beside her mother, followed a few minutes later by the familiar bell above the front door announcing Matteo Bellini's quiet arrival with 2 cups of fresh coffee and 1 cup of warm chocolate for the smallest employee in the building. Lily insisted that every workday should begin with watering the flowers before greeting the customers. She believed flowers listened better when they were comfortable. Matteo never questioned the routine. He simply carried the watering cans while Lily carefully explained which plants needed extra attention that morning. Harper often found herself watching them from behind the counter, wondering how something that had once seemed so unexpected had become the most natural part of her day. One afternoon, as winter sunlight filtered softly through the shop windows, a certified envelope arrived addressed to Harper. She immediately recognized the return address from the family court. Her hands became still before she even opened it. Matteo noticed the hesitation in her expression but remained silent, giving her the space to read at her own pace. Lily continued arranging tiny bouquets near the front display, happily humming to herself without realizing that another important chapter of her life was quietly unfolding only a few feet away. Harper slowly unfolded the documents. The court had officially accepted the voluntary surrender of Lily's father's parental rights. Every required legal review had been completed, every statement verified, every signature witnessed. There would be no future disputes, no hidden conditions, and no unexpected challenges waiting years down the road. The decision had become final. Harper lowered the papers, feeling relief and sadness arrive together. She had once dreamed that Lily would grow up with 2 loving parents. That dream had ended long ago, yet reading the final confirmation still felt like closing up a painful chapter she had carried for years. Matteo quietly asked, "Are you all right?" Harper looked toward Lily before answering. I think I finally can be. Mateo nodded gently. Sometimes peace begins when uncertainty ends. Before either of them spoke again, Lily skipped over, carrying another handwritten note she planned to tuck inside a bouquet. Mommy, how do you spell forever? Harper blinked, surprised by the question. Why do you ask? Lily proudly held up the card. In careful block letters she had written, Kindness blooms forever. Harper smiled through tears she no longer tried to hide. You spelled it perfectly. Lily beamed before returning to her work. Mateo looked at the little note with quiet admiration. She always seems to know exactly what people need to hear. Harper folded the court papers and placed them carefully inside the desk drawer beneath the register. For the first time since Lily had been born, she no longer felt trapped between hope and heartbreak. The future remained unknown, but it finally belonged to them instead of the past. That evening, after the flower shop closed, Mrs. Bellini invited everyone to dinner at her little white house. The dining table overflowed with homemade bread, roasted vegetables, warm soup, and fresh herbs from her garden. Dominic Luciano arrived carrying dessert. Raphael Marino brought flowers from Colin's Floral, and Lily proudly carried the small wooden box filled with flower seeds that Mrs. Bellini had entrusted to her months earlier. During dinner, stories replaced silence. Mrs. Bellini laughed while describing Mateo as a quiet little boy who once cried because a robin had built its nest in the wrong tree before patiently moving the fallen twigs back one at a time. Dominic shared childhood memories that made Raphael laugh so hard he nearly dropped his fork. Harper watched every conversation with growing disbelief. None of it felt rehearsed, none of it felt forced. These people genuinely cared for one another, and somehow she and Lily had been welcomed into that circle without being asked to earn their place. After dinner, Lily disappeared into the backyard with Mrs. Bellini to check whether the winter roses had survived the first frost. Harper remained on the porch beside Mateo, where tiny white lights wrapped around the railing glowed softly against the evening sky. The neighborhood was peaceful. The air smelled of pine and fresh bread. Mateo broke the comfortable silence first. Do you know what impressed me the most about you? Harper smiled gently. I am almost afraid to ask. The day we met, your own heart had just been broken, yet the first person you comforted was Lily. Harper looked toward the backyard where her daughter laughed beside Mrs. Bellini. She deserved a mother who stayed strong. Mateo looked at her with quiet certainty. She deserved exactly the mother she has. Harper felt warmth spread through her heart more deeply than any compliment had ever reached before. At that same moment, Lily came running back across the yard, holding a single white rose that had somehow bloomed despite the cold. She placed it into Harper's hands with a delighted smile. Grandma Bellini says sometimes the strongest flowers bloom when nobody expects them to. Harper looked at the unexpected blossom, then at the people gathered around the warm lights of the little house, and quietly realized that the same thing could be true about families. Harper Collins had learned that some answers arrived quietly, long before anyone found the courage to speak them aloud. Winter gradually softened into early spring, and with every new blossom opening inside Colin's Floral, she found herself smiling without first reminding herself to do it. The little flower shop seemed brighter now, not because the walls had changed, but because laughter had become part of the building itself. Every morning began with the familiar sound of Lily unlocking the front door while Matteo Bellini carried fresh coffee inside before the first customer arrived. Dominic Luciano still found small repairs that nobody else noticed, and Raphael Marino somehow convinced neighborhood children that planting flowers was every bit as exciting as playing games. What had once felt extraordinary had quietly become ordinary, and Harper realized that perhaps the greatest miracle in life was not dramatic change but peaceful consistency. One warm Saturday morning, Lily carefully counted tiny flower buds growing inside the community garden before rushing back into the shop with excitement glowing across her face. "Mommy," she called, "the daisies we planted are blooming together now." Harper stepped outside beside her daughter and looked across the garden where rows of white petals gently swayed beneath the morning breeze. The once forgotten corner of the neighborhood had transformed into the busiest place on the block. Elderly couples enjoyed coffee on the wooden benches. Children watered flowers before heading to school. Young parents stopped to take family photographs surrounded by blossoms that had not existed only a few months earlier. Harper quietly realized that hope had become contagious. While she admired the garden, Matteo walked toward her carrying a small wooden planter that had been carefully sanded and painted by hand. Lily immediately noticed the carved words across the front. "It is beautiful," Harper whispered. Matteo smiled gently. "Raphael built it." Dominic insisted the lettering should be larger. "I only carried it here." Lily laughed. "Everybody helped." Matteo looked at her with quiet affection. "That seems to be how the best things happen." Together they placed the planter beside the entrance to Colin's floral, filling it with white daisies, lavender, and tiny blue forget-me-nots. Several neighbors stopped to admire it, offering compliments before continuing with their day. Harper noticed something remarkable. Months earlier she would have politely thanked everyone, while quietly worrying about unpaid bills or tomorrow's problems. Now she found herself fully present in the moment, enjoying conversations without carrying invisible fear on her shoulders. Later that afternoon, after the flower shop closed, Matteo invited Harper and Lily to visit his mother's house once again. Mrs. Bellini welcomed them with fresh lemonade, homemade pie, and the familiar warmth that had become as comforting as home itself. Lily hurried straight into the garden carrying the old wooden box of flower seeds, eager to show Mrs. Bellini how carefully she had organized every packet by season and color. Harper watched them from the porch while Matteo stood beside her. "She loves this place," Harper said softly. Matteo nodded. "So does my mother." They stood together in comfortable silence until Mrs. Bellini called everyone into the backyard. In the center of the garden stood a young flowering dogwood tree ready to be planted. "Every family should plant something that will outlive them," Mrs. Bellini said warmly. "That way future generations will always know where love once grew." She handed the small shovel to Lily first. The little girl carefully scooped the first pile of soil before passing the shovel to Harper. Harper added another scoop before handing it to Matteo. Dominic and Raphael each took a turn as well, laughing when Lily insisted that every person had to contribute exactly one shovel of dirt because fairness mattered. Once the tree stood firmly in place, Lily tied a faded blue ribbon around its slender trunk. Harper recognized it immediately. It was the same ribbon that had once held together the bouquet rejected on a cold November afternoon. Matteo looked at the ribbon thoughtfully. "You kept it?" Lily nodded. "It reminds me that sad days can grow into happy ones." Harper felt tears quietly fill her eyes. She remembered the little girl standing alone on a porch with broken flowers in her hands. Looking at Lily now, surrounded by people who genuinely loved her, the memory no longer felt like an ending. It felt like the first page of a story that had finally found its proper direction. As the sun slowly began to set, Mrs. Bellini gathered everyone for a family photograph beneath the newly planted tree. Harper instinctively stepped aside, believing she should take the picture instead of joining it. Before she could move away, Matteo gently reached for her hand. "You belong here," he said simply. There was no grand speech, no dramatic promise, just a quiet truth spoken with complete certainty. Harper looked around the garden at Lily laughing beside Mrs. Bellini, Dominic pretending not to smile, Raphael adjusting the camera tripod, and Matteo standing patiently beside her. For the first time in many years, she stopped wondering whether happiness would disappear tomorrow. Instead, she allowed herself to believe that sometimes life really did offer second chances, not because the past could be erased, but because love had quietly grown strong enough to carry everyone beyond it. Harper Collins no longer measured time by the changing seasons. She measured it by the flowers that continued returning year after year, each bloom quietly reminding her that the hardest winters were never meant to last forever. 2 years passed with a gentleness that once seemed impossible. Collins Floral became one of the most beloved places in the neighborhood, not because it sold the most beautiful arrangements, but because everyone who walked through its front door left carrying something far more valuable than flowers. Some left with hope, others left with comfort. Many simply left smiling. The little handwritten notes Lily insisted on placing inside every bouquet became a tradition. Customers looked forward to almost as much as the flowers themselves. The garden of second chances flourished beyond anything the neighborhood had imagined. The tiny dogwood tree planted beside Mrs. Bellini's garden had grown stronger with every passing season, while the faded blue ribbon tied around its trunk remained carefully protected beneath a small glass cover so rain and sunlight could never erase the reminder of where the family's story had begun. Children who had once watched Lily plant daisies beside the empty flower bed now returned every spring carrying seeds of their own. Elderly neighbors who had once walked alone now met every Saturday morning on the wooden benches to drink coffee surrounded by blossoms they had helped nurture. Hope had become part of the neighborhood's landscape. Harper often stood outside Collins Floral before opening the shop, watching Lily laugh with Matteo Bellini while they watered the flowers together. The little girl who had once stood on a lonely porch, asking whether she had done something wrong, had become a confident child whose kindness quietly transformed every room she entered. Matteo never missed a morning if he could help it. Success had once filled his calendar. Now he believed the most important appointment of every day began with a watering can beside a flower shop. Dominic Luciano still arrived, carrying pastries more often than anyone expected, claiming he simply happened to be passing by, although nobody believed him anymore. Rafael Marino still built wooden planters for schools, churches and community centers, because Lily had once convinced him that every neighborhood deserved more flowers than fences. Mrs. Bellini remained the heart of every family gathering, filling every table with homemade bread and every conversation with gentle wisdom. Harper's life had not become perfect. Difficult days still arrived from time to time. Flowers still wilted. Storms still passed through the city, bills still needed to be paid, but she had discovered that perfect lives were not what people truly needed. They needed faithful hearts willing to stay through imperfect seasons. One bright spring afternoon, Collins Floral celebrated its anniversary with neighbors, friends and families filling both the shop and the garden outside. Children painted flower pots while musicians played soft acoustic melodies beneath blooming trees. The mayor stopped by to thank everyone for creating a place that had inspired similar community gardens across the city. Harper smiled politely through every conversation, but her eyes kept returning to Lily, who stood beside Matteo helping younger children plant their very first daisies. Watching them together, Harper realized that love had quietly answered every prayer she had once been too afraid to speak aloud. Yet she had also learned that love never rushed toward grand moments. The strongest promises were often written long before anyone spoke them aloud. They appeared in ordinary mornings, shared responsibilities, patient kindness, and the quiet decision to keep showing up, day after day. As the celebration drew to a close, Mrs. Henderson approached the small stage carrying a framed photograph. It showed the exact moment from 2 years earlier when Lily had offered a single white daisy to a stranger standing in the rain. Matteo still wore the charcoal overcoat. Lily still held the flower with both tiny hands. Harper stood only a few feet away, her face filled with uncertainty and quiet courage. Nobody in that photograph knew where life would eventually lead them. Mrs. Henderson handed the framed picture to Harper. Across the bottom, engraved in simple silver lettering, were the words, "One flower changed everything." Harper looked at the image for a long moment before tears quietly filled her eyes. She remembered every emotion from that cold November afternoon, the heartbreak, the fear, the uncertainty. If someone had told her then that the most painful day of her life would become the doorway to a future filled with hope, she would never have believed it. Lily walked over, slipped one small hand into Harper's, and reached for Matteo's with the other as naturally as though she had done it forever. "Mommy," she said softly, "do you remember when I thought nobody wanted my flowers?" Harper knelt beside her daughter and smiled through happy tears. "I remember." Lily looked around at the garden filled with smiling faces, blooming flowers, and people who had chosen to care for one another. "I think the flowers were just waiting for the right people." Harper wrapped her daughter in a warm embrace before looking toward Matteo. Their eyes met for only a moment, yet no words felt necessary. Some promises had already been quietly lived, long before they would ever be spoken. Around them, neighbors continued laughing beneath the blooming trees, while children carried tiny flower pots home as keepsakes from the celebration. The Garden of Second Chances had become far more than a place filled with flowers. It had become living proof that broken beginnings never had to decide how a story would end. As the afternoon sunlight settled gently across the garden, Harper found herself looking toward tomorrow without fear for the very first time. She did not know exactly what the future would bring. There were still dreams waiting to bloom, milestones waiting to be celebrated, and chapters that life had not yet written. For the first time in many years, she did not need to know every answer before taking the next step. She simply knew that she and Lily were no longer walking that road alone, and somewhere ahead, beyond all the ordinary mornings and quiet acts of love that had already changed their lives, another beautiful beginning was patiently waiting for the right moment to bloom. Several weeks after the anniversary celebration, Harper Collins stood once again outside the county courthouse. This time there were no anxious questions, no uncertainty, and no fear waiting behind the heavy wooden doors. Lily skipped up the courthouse steps, holding the same small wooden box of flower seeds Mrs. Bellini had given her months before. She insisted important days deserved flowers, even if the flowers had not bloomed yet. Matteo Bellini walked beside her while Dominic Luciano and Raphael Marino followed a few steps behind, both wearing the quiet expressions of men who understood that some victories never belonged on the front page of a newspaper. They belonged inside the hearts of the people who had waited the longest for them. Inside the courtroom, everything felt surprisingly ordinary. The judge reviewed the final documents one last time before looking toward Harper. "Mrs. Collins, do you understand and accept every provision before this court?" Harper answered with complete certainty. "I do." The judge turned toward Matteo. "Mr. Bellini," Matteo nodded. "I do." The final signatures were placed on the documents one after another. Months of legal reviews, interviews, background investigations, voluntary agreements had led to a single quiet moment. The judge smiled warmly before closing the file. As of today, this court recognizes Lily's permanent legal family exactly as requested. Every matter concerning her future has been fully resolved under the law. Lily looked around the room with innocent confusion. "Does that mean nobody can send me away anymore?" The judge smiled gently. "That is exactly what it means." Before anyone else could speak, Matteo slowly knelt in front of her. His voice remained calm, but every word carried the weight of a promise that would never be broken. "The day we met, you offered a stranger your last flower after someone else had broken your heart. Today I want to give you something much more important." Lily listened without blinking. Matteo continued softly. "No one will ever make you wonder whether you belong again. You already do. You belong with us. Always." Lily's eyes filled with tears before she wrapped both arms around his neck. Dominic quietly cleared his throat while pretending to study the courtroom ceiling. Raphael smiled without trying to hide it. Harper stood beside them, unable to stop the tears that finally came, not from sorrow but from relief. As they walked outside, Lily suddenly reached for Matteo's hand, then for Dominic's, then Raphael's. She laughed with complete seriousness. "Now I really have 3 scary uncles." Dominic immediately protested. "Scary? I brought you pancakes this morning," Raphael laughed. "You are lucky she did not call us old." Matteo looked at the little girl walking between them. "What do you think we are?" Lily smiled up at all 3 men. "You are the people who stayed." Nobody found a better answer than that. Later that afternoon, the entire neighborhood gathered in the Garden of Second Chances. Mrs. Henderson unveiled a new bronze plaque beside the largest flower bed. It read, "This garden was planted by people who believe should ever wonder where they belong." Beneath those words were 6 names: Harper Collins, Lily Collins, Matteo Bellini, Dominic Luciano, Raphael Marino, Mrs. Bellini. Harper quietly traced Lily's name with her fingertips before looking across the garden. Children laughed between the flowers. Neighbors greeted one another like old friends. Collins' floral overflowed with customers who had become family long ago. Even the white dogwood tree stood taller now, its branches covered with blossoms that danced gently in the spring breeze. Harper realized the story had never truly been about rejection. It had been about the extraordinary people who refused to let one little girl's kindness disappear into the world unnoticed. Years earlier, one father had closed a door without looking back. In the end, 3 powerful men, 1 courageous mother, and an entire community opened enough doors that Lily would never have to knock alone again. And among thousands of flowers blooming beneath the warm afternoon sun, the smallest white daisy still carried the greatest truth of all. Love is not proven by the people who share your name, it is proven by the people who choose every single day never to let go.